Standing in my stepfather's study after his funeral, holding a DNA test result that shattered everything I believed about my identity, I discovered the most horrifying truth imaginable. The man who raised me, who constantly reminded me I wasn't his real daughter, who treated me like an unwanted burden for 32 years, had been hiding the fact that I was actually a kidnapped heiress worth millions. My entire life was a lie, and everyone in my family knew except me. Hey everyone, before we dive into this absolutely insane family betrayal story, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below if you're ready for a wild ride full of shocking discoveries, family lies, and the sweetest revenge you've ever heard. Smash that like button and hit subscribe because this story will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't see this twist coming, and by the end, you'll be cheering for justice. Let's get started. My name is Serafina, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I was just another struggling waitress in Portland whose stepfather barely tolerated her existence. Richard Blackwood had married my mother when I was 6 months old, and from my earliest memories, he made it crystal clear that I was not his responsibility. While my half-siblings Marcus and Victoria enjoyed private schools, expensive vacations, and trust funds, I worked multiple jobs to pay for community college and lived in a cramped studio apartment. The funeral had been a cold affair. Richard died of a heart attack at 68, and even in death his presence felt disapproving. My mother had passed away from cancer when I was 12, leaving me completely dependent on a man who saw me as nothing more than his late wife's baggage. During the service, Marcus and Victoria whispered about inheritances and property divisions, pointedly excluding me from every conversation. After the burial, Victoria announced that the family would be meeting with the estate lawyer the following week. When I asked if I should attend, Marcus laughed bitterly. "Why would you need to be there, Sarah? You know Dad never considered you real family. Mom's jewelry and personal effects maybe, but that's probably it." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about their dismissive attitude felt different this time, more calculated. I remembered finding a box of my mother's belongings in the attic years ago, including medical records and documents that Richard had quickly snatched away, claiming they were private family matters. The memory nagged at me. The next morning, I drove to Richard's house one last time. Marcus and Victoria were already there, sorting through belongings with disturbing efficiency. They barely acknowledged my presence as I climbed to the attic, ostensibly to retrieve a few of my mother's books they had promised me years ago. Hidden behind old Christmas decorations, I found a metal filing cabinet I had never noticed before. The lock was broken, and inside I discovered folders labeled with my name, my mother's name, and something that made my blood run cold: Serafina Trust, Pemberton Estate. My hands shook as I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, bank statements, and correspondence dating back 32 years. The first document was a birth certificate I had never seen before, listing my name as Serafina Grace Pemberton, not Serafina Grace Morrison, as I had always believed. The next document was a death certificate for Jonathan and Eleanor Pemberton, dated when I was 6 months old, followed by a court order placing their infant daughter in the custody of Margaret Morrison, pending investigation of the estate. But according to these papers, that investigation had been fraudulently terminated by Richard Blackwood, who had somehow convinced authorities that the Pemberton child had died in the same accident as her parents. Bank statements showed a trust fund worth over $8 million that had been growing in my name for 32 years, with Richard listed as the trustee. Every year he had been collecting administrative fees and investment returns while I struggled to pay for groceries. Medical records showed that I had been treated for injuries consistent with a car accident at 6 months old, not the childhood illness story I had been told. But the most damning evidence was a series of letters between Richard and a private investigator named Douglas Mitchell. The correspondence revealed that Richard had discovered my true identity shortly after marrying my mother, but instead of revealing the truth, he had orchestrated an elaborate cover-up. The letters discussed paying off officials destroying records and ensuring that no one would ever connect Serafina Morrison to the missing Pemberton heiress. One letter from Richard to Mitchell was particularly chilling. The girl must never know her true identity. Margaret believes her first husband was Seraphina's father, and I intend to keep it that way. The Pemberton fortune will fund our family's future, and this unwanted child can earn her keep like everyone else. If she ever becomes suspicious, we have contingency plans. The final document in the folder was a recent medical report showing that Richard had been diagnosed with a terminal heart condition 6 months ago. Attached was a handwritten note. Mitchell, if anything happens to me, activate the final protocol. The girl knows nothing and Victoria and Marcus believe she's illegitimate. Transfer remaining trust assets to offshore accounts and destroy all evidence. The Pemberton line dies with me. I sat in the dusty attic surrounded by the evidence of the most elaborate betrayal imaginable. Not only had Richard stolen my inheritance and my identity, but he had systematically destroyed my self-worth while living off my family's money. Every cruel word, every reminder that I wasn't really his daughter, every time he made me feel like a burden. It had all been calculated cruelty designed to keep me from ever questioning my place in the world. The sound of footsteps on the attic stairs interrupted my shock. Marcus's voice called up, "Sarah, what are you doing up there? We need to lock up the house." I quickly shoved the documents into my purse and called back. "Just getting Mom's books like you said. I'll be down in a minute." As I descended the stairs, both Marcus and Victoria were watching me with expressions I had never noticed before. Guilt mixed with something that looked almost like fear. They knew. They had to know at least part of the truth. "Find everything you needed," Victoria asked, her voice unusually strained. "Just some old photo albums." I lied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Nothing important." But as I drove home with $8 million worth of evidence in my purse, I knew that everything was about to change. Richard Blackwood had spent 32 years stealing my life, my money, and my identity. Now it was time for him to face the consequences, even if he was dead. The question was how many other people were involved in this conspiracy, and how far were they willing to go to keep their secrets buried. The next 72 hours were the most intense of my life. I called in sick to work and spent every waking moment researching, documenting, and preparing for war. The first stop was verifying the documents I had found. A quick DNA test confirmed what the papers claimed. I was indeed Seraphina Grace Pemberton, the missing heiress, whose disappearance had been one of the most talked-about cold cases in Oregon's history. The Pemberton family had been old Portland money, with investments in timber real estate and technology that had made them incredibly wealthy. When Jonathan and Eleanor died in what was ruled a car accident, their 6-month-old daughter had supposedly died with them. But the truth was far more sinister. She had been kidnapped by the very people trusted to protect her. Armed with irrefutable evidence, I decided to confront the conspiracy head-on. But I needed to be strategic. Richard was dead, but Marcus and Victoria were very much alive, and according to the documents, they had been complicit in the cover-up for years. The lawyer handling Richard's estate was also mentioned in several documents as someone who had helped maintain the fiction. I started with Douglas Mitchell, the private investigator. His office was in a seedy part of downtown Portland, and when I arrived unannounced, his reaction told me everything I needed to know. The color drained from his face the moment I introduced myself as Seraphina Pemberton. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Seraphina Pemberton died 32 years ago." "Did she?" I asked, placing copies of the documents on his desk. "Because according to these papers, you helped Richard Blackwood fake my death and steal my inheritance. I'm very much alive and I want answers." Mitchell's hands shook as he examined the documents. "Where did you get these?" Richard said. "All the files were destroyed." "Richard lied about a lot of things," I replied coldly. "Just like you lied when you helped him cover up kidnapping and fraud. The question is, are you going to cooperate with me, or am I going to take this evidence directly to the FBI?" The threat worked. Mitchell broke down and confessed everything. He had been a young, desperate private investigator when Richard approached him with the scheme. Richard had convinced him that no one would miss the Pemberton fortune, that the family had no living relatives, and that they were simply redistributing wealth that would otherwise sit in government coffers. "He told me the girl would be better off not knowing," Mitchell said, his voice barely a whisper. said she would have a normal life instead of dealing with the pressure of inherited wealth. I believed him because I wanted the money he was offering. How much did he pay you? I demanded. 50,000 initially, then 10,000 a year to maintain the cover-up and handle any inquiries. When people occasionally asked about the missing Pemberton child, I would show them fabricated death certificates and accident reports. Who else knew the truth? Mitchell hesitated before answering. Marcus found out when he turned 21 and started asking questions about family finances. Victoria discovered it 2 years later. Richard's lawyer, Benjamin Walsh, has been helping launder the trust fund payments through fake consulting fees. And he paused, looking sick. And what? Your mother's sister, Patricia Morrison. She's known the whole time. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Aunt Patricia, who had always been cold and distant, who had never offered help during my struggles, who had always seemed to support Richard's treatment of me. She had known I was stolen from my real family and had done nothing. Where is she now? I asked through gritted teeth. She lives in Seattle. Richard has been paying her $20,000 a year to stay quiet. I left Mitchell's office with a recording of his confession and a promise that he would testify if needed. My next stop was the law office of Benjamin Walsh Esquire, who had been handling Richard's estate for over 2 decades. Walsh's office was everything you would expect from a corrupt lawyer: expensive furniture bought with dirty money, and an attitude that screamed entitlement. When I walked in and announced who I was, his first reaction was to reach for his phone. Don't even think about calling anyone, I warned, placing a digital recorder on his desk. I have evidence of 32 years of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. You can either start talking, or I can hand everything over to the State Bar Association and the FBI. Walsh was smoother than Mitchell, but the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with documented proof of his involvement, he eventually admitted to his role in the conspiracy. He had helped Richard establish fake consulting companies to justify the trust fund withdrawals, had filed fraudulent court documents, claiming the Pemberton estate had been properly distributed, and had even helped create false death certificates. Richard said it was victimless, Walsh insisted. The girl had a family who loved her, and the money was being put to good use supporting a household instead of sitting in government accounts. Loved her. I laughed bitterly. Richard spent my entire childhood reminding me I wasn't wanted. He made me work multiple jobs while my half-siblings lived off my stolen inheritance. How exactly is that love? Walsh had no answer for that. But he did provide crucial information about the scope of the conspiracy. The original Pemberton estate had been worth $12 million. Over 32 years with investments and growth, it should have been worth over $25 million. Instead, Richard had systematically drained it to fund his family's lifestyle, leaving just $8 million in the trust. Where did the rest go? I demanded. Richard's business investments, the children's education, the house cars' vacations, he treated it like his personal piggy bank. And you helped him. I was paid well to maintain the legal fiction, $50,000 a year to file the right paperwork and make sure no one asked inconvenient questions. That evening, I drove to the family home where Marcus and Victoria were still sorting through Richard's belongings. It was time for the confrontation I had been preparing for all day. I found them in the living room, surrounded by boxes and paperwork. When I walked in holding copies of the documents, their expressions immediately shifted from confusion to alarm. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Marcus asked nervously. "I came to discuss my inheritance," I replied, setting the papers on the coffee table. "Specifically, the Pemberton Trust Fund that Richard has been stealing from for 32 years. Victoria's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Victoria. I know you've both known the truth for years. I know Richard kidnapped me and stole my family's fortune. I know you've been living off my inheritance while watching me struggle to survive." Marcus stood up aggressively. "You're insane. Richard found you in foster care and gave you a home out of the kindness of his heart." "Then explain these," I said, spreading the documents across the table. Bank statements showing $8 million in a trust fund in my name. Legal documents proving I'm Serafina Pemberton, the missing heiress. Correspondence between Richard and his accomplices discussing how to keep me from ever learning the truth. Both siblings stared at the evidence in shock. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice shaking. Even if that's true, you can't prove we knew anything about it. Actually, I can. I pulled out my phone and played the recordings from Mitchell and Walsh, both of whom had explicitly stated that Marcus and Victoria knew about the conspiracy. The room fell silent, except for the damning voices coming from my phone. When the recordings finished, Marcus slumped back into his chair. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want justice," I replied. "I want every penny that was stolen from me returned with interest. I want public acknowledgement of what Richard did, and I want all of you to face consequences for 32 years of fraud and conspiracy." "And if we refuse," Victoria challenged, "then I take this evidence to the FBI tomorrow morning, along with recordings of your confessions that I'm making right now." Federal kidnapping charges don't have a statute of limitations, and neither does conspiracy to commit fraud. The power dynamic in that room had shifted completely. For the first time in my life, Marcus and Victoria were afraid of me instead of dismissive. They were finally seeing me not as their father's unwanted burden, but as the rightful heiress who could destroy their entire world. But I wasn't done yet. The biggest confrontation was still ahead of me, and it would require a trip to Seattle to face the woman who had betrayed me more than anyone else, the aunt who had watched me suffer in poverty while knowing I was worth millions. The drive to Seattle felt like traveling to another lifetime. Every mile brought back memories of family gatherings where Aunt Patricia would look at me with barely concealed disdain, always supporting Richard's harsh treatment while showering affection on Marcus and Victoria. Now I understood why. She had been paid handsomely to participate in erasing my true identity. Patricia Morrison lived in an upscale neighborhood that should have been far beyond the means of a retired schoolteacher. The house was a beautiful craftsman-style home with perfectly manicured gardens, clearly maintained with money that ultimately came from my stolen inheritance. When she answered the door, her reaction was immediate and telling. The moment she saw me, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally, a cold resignation. "Hello, Patricia," I said calmly. "We need to talk about the Pemberton family." She let me in without a word, leading me to a living room decorated with expensive antiques and artwork. On the mantel sat family photos that told a story I was only now beginning to understand. Pictures of my mother as a young woman holding a baby that I now knew was me, but conspicuously absent, were any photos of my supposed father or any wedding pictures from my mother's first marriage. "How long have you known?" Patricia asked, settling into an armchair with the weariness of someone who had been expecting this conversation for decades. "I found Richard's files 3 days ago. Douglas Mitchell and Benjamin Walsh have already confessed their roles. The question is, are you going to tell me the truth, or do I have to piece it together from the evidence?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment, staring at a photograph of my mother. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with decades of regret. "Your mother was never married before Richard," she admitted. "The story about your father dying in a car accident was a lie we created to explain your presence in our family." "Then who were my real parents?" "Jonathan and Eleanor Pemberton were your parents. Eleanor was my best friend from college. When they died in that car accident, you were critically injured but survived. The plan was for you to be placed with Eleanor's distant relatives in California while the estate was settled. But that never happened. Richard was working as an insurance investigator on the accident case. He discovered the extent of the Pemberton fortune and saw an opportunity. He convinced Margaret to take temporary custody of you while the legal arrangements were finalized, then systematically destroyed the evidence that you had survived the crash. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal. How did my mother not know the truth?" Patricia's voice broke slightly. Margaret was going through a difficult time. She had just gone through a painful divorce and was struggling financially. When Richard proposed to her and offered to help raise you, she was grateful. He told her that your biological parents had been friends of his who died without family, and that taking you in was the right thing to do. She never suspected. Richard was very careful. He created false documents showing that he and Margaret had legally adopted you after your parents' deaths. Margaret believed she was giving you a loving home, not participating in a kidnapping. But you knew better. Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. Richard approached me after they were married. He said the Pemberton money could benefit our entire family, that you would have a good life with Margaret and him, and that no one would be hurt by redirecting an inheritance that would otherwise be lost to government bureaucracy. So you agreed to stay silent. He offered me $20,000 a year to never mention your connection to the Pembertons. At the time, I was a single mother struggling to raise my own children. The money meant my kids could go to college, that I could buy a house, that we could have security. While I worked 3 jobs to afford community college, I told myself you were better off not knowing about the wealth. I convinced myself that you were living a normal, grounded life instead of dealing with the pressure of inherited money. That's a convenient lie, I said harshly. You watched Richard treat me like garbage for 32 years. You saw me struggle while Marcus and Victoria lived in luxury. You knew that luxury was bought with my money and you did nothing. Patricia broke down completely. I was a coward. Every year I told myself I would tell the truth, but the money had become essential to my life. My children's futures depended on it. I kept thinking that one more year wouldn't matter, that I would find the courage to confess eventually. Well, eventually is here, I said, pulling out my recording device. I need you to tell me everything on the record. Every detail of Richard's plan, every person who was involved, every aspect of the cover-up. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia provided a comprehensive confession that filled in the missing pieces of the conspiracy. She revealed that Richard had bribed officials in the coroner's office to falsify records, had paid lawyers to file fraudulent probate documents, and had even hired actors to pose as distant Pemberton relatives to claim there was no one to inherit the estate. But she also provided information that would prove crucial for building my case. She had kept copies of some of Richard's correspondence, including letters that proved the conspiracy extended beyond just the immediate family. Several of Richard's business associates had invested money they knew came from the Pemberton Trust, and some of Portland's most prominent attorneys and officials had received payments to look the other way. There's something else you need to know, Patricia said as our conversation was winding down. Richard was paranoid about exposure, especially in recent years. He kept detailed records of everyone involved, including evidence that could incriminate them all. He called it his insurance policy. Where are these records? He mentioned a safe deposit box that only he could access. But after his death, I believe control would pass to his estate attorney, Benjamin Walsh. Exactly. If you can get access to that box, you'll have everything you need to expose the entire network. Driving back to Portland that night, I felt the weight of 32 years of lies pressing down on me. But I also felt something else. A growing network of allies who could help me seek justice. Douglas Mitchell had agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. Benjamin Walsh was terrified enough to provide information about other conspirators. Patricia was ready to testify to save herself from federal charges. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I hired the best attorney I could find. Sarah Martinez was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime and had a reputation for taking down corrupt networks. When I walked into her downtown Portland office with boxes of evidence, her eyes lit up like a kid in a candy store. "This is the most comprehensive fraud case I've seen in 20 years of practice," she said after reviewing the documents. "We're not just talking about theft. This is racketeering, conspiracy, kidnapping, identity fraud, and corruption on a massive scale. Can we win? Can we win, Serafina? This case is going to make national news. We have recorded confessions, documentary evidence, financial records, and a victim who was systematically defrauded for over 3 decades. Not only can we win, but we're going to destroy everyone involved. Sarah immediately began building a coalition of law enforcement agencies interested in the case. The FBI was fascinated by the interstate nature of the conspiracy. The IRS was interested in decades of tax fraud related to the trust fund. The Oregon State Police wanted to pursue the corruption charges against officials who had been bribed to falsify records. We also connected with a private investigator named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in recovering stolen assets. Rebecca had experience tracking money through complex financial networks and was confident she could locate and freeze assets that had been purchased with Pemberton money. The beautiful thing about this case, Rebecca explained, is that Richard was so confident he would never be caught that he didn't bother hiding the money trail. We can trace every dollar from the Pemberton Trust to his various accounts, investments, and purchases. But our most valuable ally came from an unexpected source. 3 days after hiring Sarah, I received a phone call from a woman named Dr. Jennifer Pemberton Wright, who introduced herself as my cousin, the daughter of Jonathan Pemberton's brother. "I've been searching for you for 32 years, she said, her voice choked with emotion. "When my uncle and aunt died, I tried to locate their daughter, but was told she had died in the accident. I never believed it, but I could never prove otherwise." Jennifer was a successful cardiologist in Los Angeles who had inherited her own portion of the Pemberton family wealth. More importantly, she had resources, connections, and a burning desire to see justice done. "The Pemberton family has always taken care of its own," she told me during our first meeting. "What was done to you is unforgivable, but we're going to make it right. You'll never be alone again." With Jennifer's support, we hired forensic accountants to trace every penny of the stolen inheritance. We brought in additional attorneys to handle the various aspects of the case. We even hired a public relations firm to ensure that when the story broke, it would be told from my perspective, rather than allowing the conspirators to control the narrative. But as we were building our case and preparing for the legal battle ahead, I had no idea that one of our closest allies was about to betray us in the most devastating way possible. The person I trusted most was secretly working to protect the very people we were trying to bring down, and their betrayal would nearly destroy everything we had worked for. The war for justice was about to get much more complicated. The betrayal came from the person I least expected and trusted most, Dr. Jennifer Pemberton Wright, the cousin who had embraced me as family and promised that I would never be alone again. For 6 weeks, she had been my rock, providing emotional support, financial resources, and strategic guidance as we built our case against Richard's conspiracy network. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday morning when Sarah Martinez called me with panic in her voice. "Serafina, we have a major problem. Someone leaked our entire investigation to Benjamin Walsh, and he's moved to freeze all the evidence and dismiss our claims." "What do you mean, leaked?" "Every document we've collected, every witness statement, every piece of strategy. Walsh somehow has copies of everything. He filed an emergency motion claiming that our investigation is based on forged documents and fraudulent testimony. Worse, he's gotten Patricia to recant her confession." My blood ran cold. How is that possible? Only our inner circle had access to that information. "That's what we need to figure out. Can you get to my office immediately? We need to do damage control." Racing downtown through traffic, my mind raced through the possibilities. Mitchell was too scared to double-cross us. Patricia had too much to lose. Rebecca Torres had built her reputation on discretion. That left only 3 people with complete access to our files: Sarah, me, and Jennifer. When I arrived at Sarah's office, I found her pacing frantically while reviewing legal documents. "It's worse than I thought," she said without looking up. "Walsh has somehow obtained recordings of our private strategy sessions. He knows exactly what we're planning and has prepared counter-arguments for everything." "What kind of recordings?" Sarah played a digital file on her computer, and I heard my own voice discussing our plan to expose Marcus and Victoria's knowledge of the conspiracy. But the recording was from a private meeting in Jennifer's hotel suite, a conversation I thought only the three of us had heard. Jennifer was recording us, I asked, feeling sick. It gets worse. Look at this. Sarah handed me a series of bank statements showing large payments from a Cayman Islands account to Jennifer's medical practice. These transfers started 3 days after she contacted you. Someone has been paying her substantial sums to sabotage our investigation. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Jennifer had been playing a long game, positioning herself as my savior, while secretly working for the people who had stolen my life. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Jennifer and Benjamin Walsh. Email traffic revealed that she had been feeding him information about our legal strategy from the very beginning. But the most devastating betrayal was personal. Jennifer had asked me to confide in her about my deepest fears and insecurities, claiming she wanted to understand the emotional impact of what Richard had done to me. Those intimate conversations had been recorded and were now being used to paint me as mentally unstable and prone to fabricating stories for attention. Why would she do this? I asked Sarah, though part of me already knew the answer. Money, most likely, but also family loyalty of a different kind. I did some digging into Jennifer's background. Her branch of the Pemberton family has been struggling financially for years. Her medical practice is heavily in debt, and she's facing potential bankruptcy. So she sold me out. It appears that Walsh and his clients offered her a better deal than seeking justice for you. They probably promised her a share of the trust fund if she could discredit your claims and make the case go away. The immediate crisis was severe. With our strategy exposed and our key witness compromised, Walsh had successfully gotten a temporary restraining order, blocking our access to Richard's financial records. Patricia's recanted confession meant we had lost crucial testimony about the conspiracy's origins. Worse, Jennifer was now publicly claiming that I had approached her with a fraudulent scheme to claim inheritance that wasn't rightfully mine. Are we finished? I asked Sarah. Not by a long shot. Jennifer made a critical mistake by getting greedy. The recordings she made of our conversations were illegal without consent, which means they can't be used in court. More importantly, her sudden financial windfall and her communications with Walsh prove she's been compromised. Sarah was right, but the damage was still significant. We had lost the element of surprise and would now have to fight a defensive battle against people who knew our every move. The emotional betrayal was almost worse than the tactical setback. Jennifer had made me believe I finally had family who cared about me, only to reveal that she was just another person willing to exploit me for money. That evening, I confronted Jennifer at her hotel. She answered the door with a smug expression that told me everything I needed to know about her true character. "Hello, cousin," she said mockingly. "I suppose you've figured out that family loyalty works both ways. How much did they pay you to betray me?" $2 million up front with another $3 million when your claims are dismissed. Plus, legal protection for my practice and connections to lucrative consulting contracts. Jennifer's mask had completely dropped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You were never really family to me, Serafina. You're just a convenient fiction created by Richard Blackwood. I have DNA evidence proving I'm a Pemberton. DNA can be manipulated. Documents can be forged. Witnesses can be discredited. By the time Walsh is finished with you, no one will believe you're anything more than a delusional waitress with delusions of grandeur." The conversation was being recorded by a device Sarah had given me, but Jennifer didn't seem to care. She was confident that she and her new allies had already won. "There's something you should know," Jennifer continued with evident satisfaction. "Walsh has been in contact with Marcus and Victoria. They're prepared to file countercharges against you for attempted fraud, harassment, and extortion. By next week, you'll be the one facing criminal charges instead of seeking justice." "We'll see about that," I replied, though inside I felt the crushing weight of another devastating betrayal. Walking back to my car, I realized that Jennifer's treachery had done more than compromise our legal strategy. It had nearly broken my spirit. For a brief moment, I had experienced what it felt like to have family who truly cared about me. Losing that hope was almost more painful than learning about Richard's original betrayal. But as I drove through the Portland rain, something hardened inside me. Jennifer's betrayal had taught me an important lesson: I couldn't trust anyone completely until they had proven their loyalty through actions, not just words. The war for my identity and inheritance was far from over, and now I knew exactly how ruthless my enemies could be. The question was whether we could recover from this setback and find a way to turn Jennifer's greed against her. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals create opportunities for even sweeter revenge, but only if you're smart enough to see the possibilities hidden in the wreckage of broken trust. The morning after Jennifer's betrayal, I woke up feeling like I was starting over from scratch. But as I sat in my studio apartment reviewing the wreckage of our legal strategy, I realized that Jennifer's treachery had actually revealed something crucial. The conspiracy was far more desperate and extensive than we had originally understood. Sarah called me at 8 a.m. with news that would change everything. I spent all night analyzing Jennifer's communications with Walsh, and I found something interesting. She's not just working with him, she's been coordinating with someone else, someone with enough power to orchestrate this entire counterattack. Who? Judge Harold Pemberton. He's Jonathan's older brother and the head of the family trust that was supposedly disbanded after the accident. According to Jennifer's emails, he's been alive and active this entire time, secretly managing Pemberton family assets and working to keep your existence hidden. The revelation was staggering. Judge Harold Pemberton was a prominent figure in Oregon's legal establishment, respected for his integrity and known for his harsh sentences for white-collar criminals. If he was involved in covering up my identity, the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the state's judicial system. Why would he want to hide me? I asked Sarah. Money and power. If you had remained dead, Harold would have inherited complete control of the entire Pemberton fortune, not just his brother's share. We're talking about assets worth over $50 million that he's been managing as his personal empire for 32 years. But Sarah had more news. There's someone who wants to meet with you. Someone who's been investigating Harold Pemberton for years and has evidence that could destroy his entire operation. An hour later, I found myself in a downtown coffee shop, meeting with Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos, a veteran investigator with the Oregon State Police Financial Crimes Unit. Maria was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen enough corruption to last several lifetimes. I've been building a case against Harold Pemberton for 8 years, Maria told me quietly. Your situation is just one piece of a massive puzzle involving judicial corruption, money laundering, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Maria explained that Harold had been using his position as a judge to protect a network of corrupt lawyers, accountants, and business associates who helped him steal from estates and trust funds. My case was particularly valuable because it provided direct evidence of his involvement in identity fraud and conspiracy. The problem is that Harold has been very careful to insulate himself from direct involvement, Maria continued. Most of our evidence is circumstantial, but Jennifer's communications prove that he's been actively directing the cover-up of your identity. What do you need from me? Your cooperation in a controlled operation. We want to set up a meeting where Jennifer thinks she's delivering you to Harold for a final confrontation. We'll record everything and finally get the evidence we need to bring down his entire network. The plan was risky, but brilliant. Maria's team would wire me with recording equipment and surveillance devices, then arrange for Jennifer to bring me to a meeting with Harold under the pretense of negotiating a settlement. Harold's arrogance and need to control the situation would hopefully lead him to incriminate himself on tape. But first we needed to reinforce our evidence base. Maria introduced me to a forensic accountant named David Kim, who had been secretly tracking Harold's financial activities for years. David had discovered that Harold had been systematically looting trust funds and estates under his control, using complex financial instruments to hide the theft. Your inheritance is just the tip of the iceberg, David explained. Harold has stolen over $20 million from various trusts and estates over the past 3 decades. He uses a network of shell companies and offshore accounts to launder the money, then reinvests it in legitimate businesses to create the appearance of lawful wealth. David had also uncovered evidence that Richard Blackwood hadn't acted alone in orchestrating my kidnapping. Harold had been the one to suggest the scheme after learning about my survival from insurance reports. The plan had been Harold's from the beginning. Richard was just the front man who implemented it. Harold couldn't risk being directly involved because of his judicial position, David continued. But he coordinated everything behind the scenes, including bribing officials and arranging for false documents. The evidence was overwhelming, but we needed Harold's confession to tie everything together. Maria's surveillance team spent 2 days setting up the operation, placing cameras and listening devices in a conference room at Harold's private club where the meeting would take place. Jennifer took the bait perfectly. When Maria's team leaked information suggesting that I was ready to accept a settlement and disappear, Jennifer immediately contacted Harold to arrange the meeting. Her greed and overconfidence made her sloppy. She never suspected that we were manipulating her actions. The confrontation took place on a gray Saturday morning in the elegant conference room of Harold's exclusive club. When I walked in wearing hidden recording devices, Harold Pemberton was exactly what I expected. A distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect in courtrooms. But his eyes were cold and calculating as he studied me across the mahogany conference table. "So, you're the little girl who's been causing all this trouble," Harold said with a condescending smile. "You look remarkably like your father. It's unfortunate that Jonathan didn't live to see what his daughter became." "You mean what you turned me into?" I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "A stolen child raised in poverty while you lived off her inheritance." Harold laughed. "Poverty. My dear, you were given a perfectly adequate middle-class upbringing. Richard and Margaret provided you with food, shelter, and education. Many children receive far less. While you and your accomplices stole $50 million that belonged to me. Money that would have been wasted on a child with no understanding of its value. I've spent 32 years building that inheritance into something far more substantial than your parents ever could have achieved." Harold's arrogance was working in our favor. He seemed unable to resist explaining his cleverness, detailing how he had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. He described bribing coroner's officials, manipulating court records, and coordinating with Richard to create a false identity for me. "The beautiful irony," Harold continued, "is that you'll never be able to prove any of this. Jennifer has provided us with recordings of your conversations discussing how to fabricate evidence and intimidate witnesses. By the time we're finished, you'll be facing federal charges for conspiracy and attempted fraud." "Is that why you had Jennifer betray me?" "Jennifer understands family loyalty unlike you. She knows that the Pemberton name and fortune should remain with those who can properly manage it, not be given to some waitress who thinks she deserves wealth simply because of an accident of birth." But Harold made a critical mistake. In his arrogance, he began describing details of the conspiracy that only someone with direct involvement could know. He revealed that he had personally selected the officials to bribe, had chosen Richard as the perfect accomplice, and had been monitoring my life for decades to ensure I never became suspicious. "I've watched you struggle and fail for 32 years, Harold said with evident satisfaction. "Every setback, every disappointment, every moment of desperation. I've enjoyed knowing that Jonathan's daughter was learning the value of hard work instead of living off inherited wealth." The recording devices captured every word, every admission, every detail of Harold's involvement in stealing my life. When Maria's team finally burst through the conference room doors to arrest him, the shock on his face was worth 32 years of suffering. Jennifer tried to run, but was tackled by officers in the hallway. Her recorded conversations with Harold proved that she had been an active participant in obstructing justice, not just a compromised witness. As Harold was being read his rights, he looked at me with pure hatred. "You think you've won, but destroying me won't give you back the life you lost. You'll always be damaged goods, a broken person who never learned how to belong anywhere." "Maybe," I replied, "but at least I'll be a broken person with $50 million and the satisfaction of knowing that you'll spend your remaining years in prison." Walking out of that conference room, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. The scared, insecure girl who had spent her life feeling unwanted and worthless was finally gone, replaced by a woman who had fought for justice and won. But the story wasn't over yet. Harold and his network were facing criminal charges, but there was still the matter of recovering my stolen inheritance and dealing with the aftermath of 32 years of lies. The final chapter of this saga would determine not just whether I got my money back, but whether I could build a new life from the ashes of the old one. The collapse of Harold Pemberton's criminal network was swift and devastating. Within 72 hours of his arrest, federal and state investigators had frozen over $30 million in assets, arrested 12 co-conspirators, and uncovered evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of Oregon's legal establishment. Benjamin Walsh was arrested at his law office while attempting to shred documents. The safe deposit box Patricia had mentioned yielded a treasure trove of evidence that Harold had kept as insurance against his accomplices. Detailed records of every bribe, every falsified document, and every person who had participated in the conspiracy over 3 decades. Marcus and Victoria were charged with conspiracy and money laundering. Their shock at being arrested was almost comical. They had grown up believing they were entitled to wealth that was never theirs to inherit. Victoria broke down completely during questioning, sobbing that she had never understood the full scope of Richard's crimes. Marcus tried to maintain his arrogance until faced with irrefutable evidence of his participation in spending money he knew was stolen. Patricia pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for testimony against Harold. During her sentencing hearing, she finally offered the apology I had been waiting 32 years to hear, though by then it felt hollow and inadequate. She received 5 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution of $400,000, the total amount she had received over the years for her silence. Douglas Mitchell and Rebecca Torres, the private investigator I had trusted, both received lighter sentences for their cooperation. Mitchell's testimony was particularly valuable in proving Harold's direct involvement in orchestrating the original conspiracy. But the most satisfying moment came during Harold's sentencing hearing. The man who had spent decades projecting an image of judicial integrity was revealed as a common thief who had stolen millions from orphans and vulnerable families. The judge who sentenced him, a former colleague who had respected Harold for years, expressed disgust at the scope of his betrayal of public trust. "You have disgraced not only yourself, but the entire judicial system," Judge Morrison told Harold, before sentencing him to 25 years in federal prison. "Your abuse of position and exploitation of vulnerable people represents the worst kind of corruption our society can face." Harold showed no remorse, even at the end. As he was led away in shackles, he looked at me with the same cold hatred he had displayed during our recorded confrontation. But his hatred no longer had any power over me. He was just a pathetic old man who had thrown away his life and reputation for money that was never his to take. Jennifer received 15 years for her role in obstructing justice and conspiracy. Her medical license was revoked, and she was ordered to pay complete restitution for the money she had received from Harold's network. During her sentencing, she finally admitted that her betrayal had been motivated entirely by greed, not family loyalty as she had claimed. The financial recovery process took months, but the results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Forensic accountants traced and recovered over $45 million in stolen assets, including properties, investments, and offshore accounts that Harold had used to hide the money. With accumulated interest and investment returns, my rightful inheritance totaled just over $52 million. But the money, while life-changing, was secondary to the personal transformation I underwent during the legal process. Working with Maria Santos and her team had shown me what it meant to be part of a group fighting for justice rather than personal gain. These people had become the family I had never had, chosen family bound by shared values rather than blood or obligation. Maria offered me a position as a consultant with her financial crimes unit, helping to investigate cases involving stolen inheritances and identity fraud. The work was meaningful and used skills I had developed during my own investigation. For the first time in my life, I was part of something larger than myself. Sarah Martinez became not just my attorney but a close friend and mentor. She helped me establish a foundation dedicated to helping other victims of identity theft and inheritance fraud. The Serafina Pemberton Foundation provides legal assistance, investigative resources, and emotional support for people trying to recover stolen identities and assets. David Kim, the forensic accountant who had helped build the case against Harold, became the foundation's financial director. His expertise in tracking hidden assets made him invaluable in helping other victims recover what had been stolen from them. Even Dr. Rebecca Torres, despite her initial betrayal, proved her loyalty by testifying against Harold and helping investigators understand the full scope of his financial crimes. Sometimes people make mistakes when desperate, but their actions afterward reveal their true character. The Foundation's first major case involved helping a young man in California who had discovered that his adoptive parents had stolen his inheritance after his biological family died in a plane crash. Using techniques we had developed during my own investigation, we were able to recover over $8 million and expose a corruption network similar to Harold's operation. But perhaps the most meaningful relationship to emerge from this ordeal was with Detective Maria Santos herself. Over months of working together, our professional relationship had evolved into something deeper. Maria understood the trauma of betrayal in ways that most people couldn't, having spent years investigating cases where trusted figures had exploited vulnerable victims. 6 months after Harold's sentencing, Maria and I were married in a small ceremony attended by our chosen family, Sarah, David, Rebecca, and other colleagues who had become our closest friends. It wasn't the traditional wedding I had once imagined, but it was perfect for two people who had learned that the most valuable relationships are built on shared values and mutual respect rather than obligation or convenience. The house we bought together in Portland's West Hills was purchased with money that was rightfully mine, but it felt like a home in ways that no place had ever felt before. For the first time in my life, I was living with someone who truly wanted me there, who valued my presence rather than tolerating it. On quiet evenings, Maria and I would sit on our deck overlooking the city and discuss the cases we were working on, the victims we were helping, and the plans we had for expanding the Foundation's work. Sometimes we talked about starting a family of our own, creating the kind of loving environment that neither of us had experienced growing up. The scars from 32 years of emotional abuse and betrayal didn't disappear overnight. I still sometimes caught myself expecting the people I cared about to eventually reject or abandon me. But therapy, combined with the daily evidence of being truly loved and valued, gradually healed wounds I hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that discovering the truth about my identity had given me something more valuable than $50 million. It had given me the courage to stop accepting treatment that I didn't deserve and to demand the respect and love that every person has a right to expect. The waitress who had once struggled to pay rent had become an advocate for justice, a loving wife, and someone who could make a real difference in other people's lives. Richard Blackwood had tried to steal my entire identity, but in the end, he had only delayed my discovery of who I was truly meant to become. Today, when I meet with families who have been torn apart by greed and betrayal, I can offer them something that most attorneys and investigators cannot: the absolute certainty that justice is possible, that truth will eventually surface, and that sometimes the best revenge is living well and helping others do the same. Harold Pemberton thought he was teaching me the value of hard work by keeping me in poverty, but what he actually taught me was the value of fighting for what's right, the importance of choosing your family carefully, and the truth that real wealth comes from meaningful relationships and purposeful work rather than inherited money. I've learned that family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about the people who stand by you when everything falls apart, who celebrate your victories, and who help you become the person you're meant to be. In that sense, I'm richer now than Harold Pemberton ever was, even when he had control of $50 million that didn't belong to him. The little girl who once believed she wasn't worthy of love or belonging has become a woman who knows her own value and isn't afraid to demand that others recognize it too. And that transformation is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. So here's my question for all of you who followed this incredible journey with me. Have you ever discovered that the people you trusted most were hiding devastating secrets? How do you rebuild your life when everything you believed about your family turns out to be a lie? Share your stories in the comments below, because I truly believe that speaking our truth helps others find the courage to seek their own justice. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and finding your true family. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight for what's rightfully yours. Thank you for being part of my chosen family here on this channel, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful life is the one you build from the ashes of the lies others told you about who you were supposed to be. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than everything you're worth.